Pomona College, right, in California. And then PhD at Colorado State University. So he was interested in science and policy of public lands. So I think one of the interesting things is you, and I'm sure we'll want to pick your brain about if you don't talk about it. He was on the scientific advisory board for the BLM. They had one of these things at one point, which they don't now. Is that right?
Yeah, I was the chair, actually.
Yeah. And one of their goals was to improve communication, right, among scientists and managers. And so now, and for those during the Bush,
Kathleen Clark abolished it.
Okay.
Kathleen Clark's a character.
Okay. So decided they didn't need this advisory. So we were actually earlier in this class talking about how the administration doesn't have or has a science advisory board that's not made up of scientists sometimes.
Yeah, and that can be good or bad. The reason to say I was chair of the BLM board is I knew the BLM and the culture and its policies really well. So the other people said, why don't you chair it? Because you work with them well. But I'm a policy guy, so I didn't make science changes.
Yeah, right.
But it was good. We were from very many different disciplines, so that was fun.
Yeah, so that was in the 1990s?
It was about from mid-90s to 2001, so 6 or 7 years. Yeah. Got to do fun things like get helicoptered onto the Bering Glacier to look at the research going on. You might call that boondoggle, but it was sure fun.
He was also a high school teacher, right? And a park ranger, only in Glen Canyon National Park?
Glen Canyon and Grand Canyon.
And Grand Canyon. All right. You a river runner then?
I am not a river runner. I did patrol up to the dam, where one day I came off patrol and there was a guy there with his daughter, and the guy was Edward Abbey.
Oh.
If you don't know who Edward Abbey is, you should learn who Edward Abbey was. But I didn't really talk to him because I didn't want to disturb him and his daughter. But he was there.
Cool,
yeah.
And he was also Professor of the Year in 2001. So it was kind of
back when they were awarded good teaching.
So that's my
good enough.
Introduction.
I'm also the senior fellow, I just throw this out because it connects a lot of what I do, at the Andrus Center, where I'm the senior fellow for environment and public lands. I was in Cecil Andrus, and you guys are getting younger every year while we get older, but he was a 4-term governor and Secretary of Interior from Idaho, and probably, well, Chris Carlson, who was one of his staffers, would say he was Idaho's greatest governor, but obviously that's a value judgment. And I'll start with just an Andrus story, and then I don't have to have canned remarks, have lots of thoughts, so I just as soon say things and have questions and interact in the day. It's the last week, it's finals, you don't need another lecture for that long. Not that she lectures badly.
That's why they like me, I don't say anything.
So you guys may be following a little bit the controversy over the Boulder White Clouds, whether it should be a national monument or wilderness. And a friend of mine who actually worked for Andrus when he was governor, we have this fun little graph where we change the odds in which it's going to be every week, just on our whimsy and stuff in the news. It's hardly science-based. And we're smart guys, so maybe it's okay. So, and the reason the monument came up, in part, is Andrus suggested it at something called Wild Idaho, which some of you might know is the Idaho Conservation League has a sort of kick off the summer conference at Redfish Lake that's on public lands and wilderness. And it's really, I've gotten to speak at it. It's a really kind of cool thing. They'll get me people to speak and so forth. Well, Andrus suggested Andrus is an admirer of Mike Simpson, Congressman Simpson, who in my personal judgment is a moderate conservative that works across the aisle. Feel free to disagree with me, that's fine. Simpson's never been able to pass a wilderness bill. And so Andrus suggested the National Monument Route, which the President of the United States may do on his own. The reason Andrus suggested it, and this is the Andrus story, is during the fight over Alaska, which happened happened for a long time, but Cease was Secretary of Interior from 77 to 80. And President Carter was here actually on a float trip on the Middle Fork with Secretary Andrus when he was president, which drove the Secret Service nuts, as you can imagine when they did it. And in the politics over it, they were making a lot of progress, and it had to do with how much wilderness was going to be in Alaska, new national parks, BLM land, but land would go to the natives. for their native corporations, what land would go to the states, the state of, and so forth and so on. And they made a lot of progress, and then Mike Gravel got up to filibuster a bill. And Gravel, we remember more for something he did that was good, which was leak the Pentagon Papers, which told us all how we got in that Vietnam conflict, all right? Right or wrong or indifferent. It was a lot of papers that he had access to. Well, on this one, he was not very productive. And so Andrews sat down, and he's told me the story. It's a great story with President Carter. And they were like, what are we, we're getting there, what do we do? And Secretary Andrews said, well, Mr. President, there's a tool you can use. Now remember, Carter was from Georgia. So he wasn't, I mean, he was an outdoorsman, but he's not as familiar with public lands as somebody like Andrews would be. He said, you have this power, and I have a power. I have a power under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, which is BLM's Organic Act. An Organic Act is simply the act that sets the mission for a federal agency. Park Service has one, Forest Service has one, if we're talking public lands, BLM has one, but it was only 1976. That's not that long ago, all right? The current director of BLM, who was in town this week, is so young, he's younger than FLPMA, which is the first time in history that's happened. But anyway, so Andrews could withdraw land for a certain amount of time under his power as secretary, but the president could use the Antiquities Act to proclaim national monuments. And so what essentially Andrews explained to the president is, we can use this, and we can, through our two powers, we can set aside about 110 million acres. And we'll do it strategically to get Congress to finally get Gravel to stop, and we can get something done. And Carter looked at him and said, I can do that? Well, yes, sir, you can. So let's do it. They used the Antiquities Act, and they forced Congress to compromise, and they were able to. And so you understand what 100 million acres is. The entire park system in the United States is 80 million acres. That's a lot of land. They got something done as a result. Andrews probably remembered that as a tool to try to actually get some wilderness done under the threat of a national monument. And if you want to divert into what that all means politically and policy-wise, I'm glad to do it. But that's probably why he suggested it. I have no idea what's going to happen. My current take is that the chairman of the House Resources Committee is such a nut job that I think he continues to push for things like federal land transfer to the states, which is a dumb idea in my opinion, for many reasons. And he keeps saying this wacky stuff that at some point I'm going to wonder whether he's going to become such a lightning rod. And you guys probably think about Congress like I do. I'm not a real fan of those people anymore. They can't do anything. So one wonders, see what happens essentially is everybody agreed to give Mike Simpson about 7 months to get something done up there. And they might give him a little more time, but if he doesn't, all the president has to do, and they're working on a proclamation just to make sure. And so one of the two things is going to happen. And I'm pessimistic about wilderness passing right now. But I wanted to, we have PhDs, and then there's the idea of getting a PhD in the real world, which is hanging out with Cecil Andrus and learning stuff that you never learn in academia. That's all. And he's a great man, whether you be a Republican or Democrat. And he's done a lot for the environment over his career, and he's still very active, sharp as a tack, though 83 now. So with that, you guys, a lot of you are scientists. I'm pretty much involved with sage grouse. One of the reasons is that, and I saw the book in here a minute ago.
Tom, you did the forward in it.
You guys have to read this? Anyway, I wrote the forward on that called Thoughts on the Role of Science in Public Policy, mainly because Steve Knick, who's right here in town, along with Jack Connolly, were the editors of that book. And I was really flattered that Steve asked me to write kind of this essay at the beginning. And that book is probably getting a little dated now because, as you know, as scientists, you continue to do more research, which we always need to do. But it's still sort of the state of the science. And there's a whole story of why they did that book that maybe I can circle back around to prevent improper editing from state fish and game agencies. What essentially happens in a nutshell, my theme here, there's the rational world that probably all of you wish existed, where best science gets used, even though that's a problematic concept, best science. And then there's the world of how decisions get made, okay? It's not that science gets ignored, that there's just a rest of the story to everything. It's a great book, and I'm going to talk a little bit in one of my theme here, but please interject anytime you want with what's happened to peer review and all of this. And Jen, especially, you might be appalled when you hear some of this if you haven't heard it already. All right, but essentially, what we've got with the sage grouse, right, is well, some people have used and will use the Endangered Species Act for all sorts of purposes, okay? The Endangered Species Act is a strong law. It is the strongest environmental law in the United States, if perhaps not the world. It's what we call a thou shalt not law. There's no, well, you know, we think this bird's endangered, but it's going to cost too much, therefore we won't list. You can't do that. It's sort of science-based, as much as anything can be. I mean, it is science-based. There are a few qualifications to it. There is something called the God Squad. Are you familiar with that? Essentially, you can get an exemption from the Endangered Species Act if high-level politicals like the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Ag, it's either the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of the Army, because of federal training issues and military issues involving endangered species, exempted. It's called the God Squad simply because it's sort of playing God. It's never been used in our history except once on the snail darter in Tennessee in the 70s. All right, it was invoked on the spotted owl controversy, but it really didn't have much of an effect. So there is a way, as it should be, I'd argue, for high-level political people to go on the record and say, listing this is too harmful, therefore we're going to make some exemptions to it, okay? But that's, like I said, once in almost 50 years in American history, if not longer, okay? Well, with a sage grouse, and I'm a public policy guy, I think that it's pretty clear that the habitat is in jeopardy and the populations are declining. I mean, unless you're crazy, you don't acknowledge that, okay? And there's a lot of people working really hard, I think, right now to try to avoid a listing by doing collaborative work on the ground. Fish and Wildlife listed a subspecies, the gunnison, in Colorado, simply because, as I understand it, and please, again, I'm a public policy professor, so if somebody wants to add to my description, they certainly can. But the core species were so separated that they had to list them because they weren't linked, and they were worried if they would wink out that way. They decided not to list a sort of a, I don't think it's a subspecies, but it's a part of the greater sage grouse in the Nevada-California border. But that's a small population, and they spent a lot of money on collaborative work, and Secretary Jewell, who I think is a real believer in collaboration and would like to not list, but certainly will list if it has to be done, though it's a Fish and Wildlife decision technically. And it's a belief. She's been to Idaho several times. We're working at the Andrews Center on an invasive summit and on a fire summit, and I can talk about that later. Nothing's come to pass yet, but they essentially want a neutral source to convene some more meetings on this. The biggest habitat, well, Wyoming has a lot of oil and gas interference with sage grouse habitat because they're an oil and gas state. We're really not. We have a lot of the key habitat in southern Nevada, or northern Nevada and southern Idaho, right? And the number one worry is fire. I don't know if some of you have ever fought fire, but if we get a bad fire this summer in the upper, well, the sage grouse steppe ecosystem, I don't care what anybody's done, it could be too much. And then we have problems with invasives like cheatgrass that come in. all the rhetoric aside, I think a fair way to look at it is, if that species gets listed, we are going to get diverted into political warfare again. War on the West, rhetoric out of the right wing, inability of anybody to do anything progressive, and we're just going to spend a lot of time, all right? And it's going to be a mess. So a lot of people are trying to do enough collaborative work that can show fish and wildlife that enough is being done to stabilize and protect the habitat and help. And then with populations, though they are naturally cyclical, as I understand it too, from avoiding a listing. It is the biggest issue in the West. It ain't climate change. And I don't want to get on that one because I am so bothered by how that's been hijacked by rhetoric on both sides. I will leave that aside. It's a much bigger issue than climate change. Obviously, whether climate change is human-induced or a natural cycle, change on the landscape affects the sage grouse too. That's obvious. We're seeing more fires, for example. So probably because of working on Steve's book and then other work I do, and then through the Andrews Center and past experience I've had with interior people, I've gotten pretty involved in it again. There was a big conference in November here on fire and invasives where, I mean, it was a big deal. And when the federal government can decide to do something in May or June and pull it off by November, and the key there is the assistant secretary, who's a marvelous lady named Jenna Schneider. She wanted it to happen. And it happened, and they had the head of the Forest Service out here, they had the head of BLM, they had the head of Fish and Wildlife, and a bunch of scientists all trying to kind of get to the state of what's going on and next steps, because essentially BLM, which has most of the sage grouse habitat, but not all of it, Forest Service has a little, and there's obviously private land and state land, is really essentially trying to reorient its approach to fire in the next couple of summers. And here's something to remember. When we talk about public policy, we get into organizations, and this is true for any organization, public or private or nonprofit. But organizations have biases, they have cultures, they have ways of doing things. Sometimes those are good, and sometimes they're, well, we've always done it this way, okay? And one of those cultures is the fire culture. Now, these guys and women can be on one side heroes when they're out there fighting the fire. But on the other side of it, they like doing it their way. Okay, as we had an Andrews conference on fire about 10 or 15 years ago, and one of the things we concluded, and it might have been Cease himself who said this, I don't know, that is NIFC, which is the fire center up at the airport, which is the incident logistics center for fire in North America, essentially. They dispatch people where they need to go. They study what's coming. They're worried, for example, about a bad fire summer already. But in this one meeting, I think it was right after I talked, the argument was made, and I think correctly, that if protecting sage-grouse habitat is the #1 goal right now to avoid a listing, then we need to reorient our attack on fire. Right now, the fire priorities are life, property, resource. And it was actually the director of BLM who got up there and said, maybe we need to redo that. Obviously, life is first, but then maybe it ought to be resources and not property. Okay. And it led to, well, you know, if we've got a rangeland fire, don't we maybe need rangeland ecologists and others, the bird people out there with the incident commanders saying, you need to put your resources over there. That's the key habitat. We cannot lose that habitat, this fire. Makes sense, doesn't it? They would be like advisors. But here's the fire community is conservative. Well-intentioned fire boss raises his hand, well, we can't have that because the biologists won't have red cards. A red card is what you have to go through to be certified to fight a fire. But nobody was saying in the discussion that they wanted the biologist fighting the fire. They wanted the biologist to be advising the incident commander where to put our resources. And that's an example of conservative culture. Oh, if they don't have a red car, they're unsafe. Baloney. Not if they're nowhere near the fire, they'll be fine. The frickin' reporters are out there. And it was just a point that this is how hard it is to change policy. Okay, because people have a way of doing things. And yeah, red cards make sense. But if it prevents biologists getting their information to incident commanders quick enough to allocate the resources where they ought to go, we could lose habitat. Go ahead, Stuart.
But we do have someone like that out there who's supposed to advise the firefighters, and that's our Reed.
Yeah, well, see, and nobody even brought that up.
Right.
But hey, we've already got people like that.
But the fire bosses don't tend to follow what the Reed guy says. They
No.
do it their way.
It's sort of a, you know, and I get in trouble with them, but I have other people come up and tell me this, you know, I'm glad you said that. It's kind of a quasi-military system in the wrong way. You get there, by God, you're the man. And you don't care about the frickin' laws. You're just gonna do your stubborn manly thing or woman thing. And all organizations have, you know, people in them like that. The fire guys are great, they're my friends, but they do it their way. And they love to spend a lot of our money fighting fire, which we want them to do, but maybe not the way they do it anymore. Complicated issue, but thank you for pointing that out. It's a good one, good one.
What does Reed stand for? It's resource, I agree with he is, and advisor. He basically looks at everything from vegetation to resources like cultural resources.
Yeah,
Everything.
And he's probably got too big a book to advise on. So that's why you get more special sagebrush colleges out there. They're gonna know exactly where that key habitat is.
And the lack of exchanging information and getting it to the Reed guy, and then the lack of fire implementing, it's a debacle.
Evidence.
So how is it that you, I mean, we have amazing maps of where the priority habitats are. How is it that you even need somebody out there? I mean, aren't maps being used as to where
Well,
they
I
are
think
and
he
where
maybe
fires are going?
nailed that. If the guy's out there without just the map, he might have a tendency to want to do things his way.
Okay,
But if you've got a voice in his ear
Ah,
on top of the map,
I see.
saying, you know, the map, we gotta, you know, and this is why Secretary Jewell has changed the, I mean, they're trying to send a signal to the entire fire community, we've got to do this because the consequences for everybody is not worth your pride here. You know, I always have done it this way kind of thing. That would be my guess. I mean, I have a huge USGS grant on gap analysis and protected area data, all that stuff. I have 6 wizards who do that. I supervise, which means I do big thing policy stuff and let them do the good work. But yeah, they did a lot of that mapping in Nevada and got a lot of kudos. So just finding a sagebrush habitat. That's one of my great cliches here that I can circle around to is science is a necessary but insufficient condition for policy making, but that's the necessary part. Without good information, you're shooting guns at fire or something. Do you have a question?
Comment, actually.
Yes.
I've decided to hold it for later.
Okay. That's your discretion.
I want to let you finish getting through what you're talking about right now.
Well, I'm kind of just talking, trying to bring up, I think, the key stuff. So whenever you feel like it.
So has the battle been won already that we all, whoever that is, agree that sage-grouse is the priority?
Not with everybody. Mainly, I want to see how the fires get fought this summer. And this summer's a quick response. It's the next summer where they're doing all the big work. And that's why I think, as I understand it, they've come, I'm gonna have a meeting tomorrow with some of the BLM fire people up at NIFC, and they're gonna tell me what they'd like the Andrews Center to do, which I think has helped to prioritize where the resources should go more than they've done. And they want us to help them. We're not the experts. We'll facilitate and run it. We'll get the experts in there because there's a weird federal law called FACA, which is Federal Advisory Committee Act, which essentially would work like this badly for BLM. If they did it on their own and made decisions and people said, we weren't involved, and you made decisions with this little group here, you violated FACA. When I was BLM Science Board Chair, we were a FACA chartered committee. In other words, we were given the authority by federal law through Bruce Babbitt to advise BLM on science issues. But if the BLM just goes out and gets a couple of scientists together, what do we do? That's a violation, okay? Because they're not, I mean, they have to they have to make it open to everybody. So I think maybe they could have done it, but they were worried enough. They said, why don't we get the Andrews Center to do it? Because if we host it as a nonprofit, nonpartisan, then we're not making decisions. The invasive one is, as I understand it, invasives are also a big issue. And I think they want to find a way to kind of find out what to do and what the priorities need to be with this change in policy. Because right now there are people who do fire, and fire is a huge threat, and then there's invasives are a huge threat, and anybody knows they're related. You get a fire, what comes in, invasives come in. But they're battling communities. You know, the invasive people think that's a big deal, and it is. And as I understand this, and the fire people think that's a big deal, and it is. So I've been approached by the invasives committee through the assistant secretary or deputy assistant secretary, and approached by the fire people by the fire people. So I'm like, are you guys talking to each other?
Yeah.
I'm gonna figure that out. They're all good people.
Right.
It's like, I don't talk, I like the biology department, I'm giving talks, but I'm not like knowing what they're doing. I do know there's a split in the department between the field people and where the money is people, but that's another organizational conversation. Don't get me started. Academic culture, it's just as weird. Okay, so the science of sage grouse is very important. Okay, let me tell you some stories though that are just, I mean, disturbing to me. All right, so I'm going to back up. During the Bush administration, all right, there was a precursor to this thing here. It's sort of a science assessment on the state of the sage grouse in the mid, like 2003, 2004. And all this was you know, the biologists, the sage grouse ecologists, kind of, here's what we know, right? And this was a very important document to inform the listing decision. They were talking about a listing decision, 12 years ago. And this moved slowly, okay? And I'm working on my desk, and I get a call. And this happens occasionally. I know I may sound like I'm Mr. Important here. It's the New York Times. It's a reporter, Felicity Berger, who does a lot of Western stuff. She goes, hey, I know you've been involved in this, a lot of this public language stuff. Somebody just sent me a document. They leaked a document to me. Okay, understand, your government can't keep a secret. Well, maybe it can, because if it can, I wouldn't know what that was, right? But this is why, by the way, I don't think there's UFOs and aliens, because they can't keep something like that a secret, okay? You can feel free to disagree with that statement, but my point is, what did Snowden do? Whether you agree with it or not, he leaked a lot of secret stuff about surveillance, right? There are enough people in government who think that if something illegal or wrong is happening, they may risk their careers to leak something. Well, here's what happened. This was an edited version of that science document by an assistant secretary at the Bush administration. And I'm going to actually try to find this in my paper and read this to you, because as scientists, you'll probably be appalled.
And this is a document like there's a book that has chapters related to the document that you're talking about?
It wasn't a book, but it was a fairly long science assessment. And I have the leaked documents still in my files, Jen, and I'm actually more than willing to show you that if you'd like. I just want to find the quote if I can here, because
I'm guessing because it was leaked that.
well, you're going to see why. Okay, she goes, all right, the issue here is this. Can political appointees take a science document and edit it? Yes, that's appropriate if they want something rephrased. but they can't just blatantly change what's said in there. What you have to understand is, it goes back to my science is necessary but insufficient. I always tell people, when somebody says the science is in, hang on to your wallet, because they've got a separate agenda. C. Sanders again said it well. Best science is the science that backs up where I wanted to go anyway, right? And the answer is, the science is in, great, but so what? The decision isn't a science decision, it's a political decision. We need good science. But when people say the science is in, are scientists in charge? No. Should they be? That's an open question to me. Sometimes I think they do a better job than some of these yahoos we elect. But again, that's a different point of view. All right, but listen to this. Because so she asked me about, do you think this assistant secretary, whose name was Julie McDonald, who was an engineer over the BLM and some other agencies, Fish and Wildlife, or involved with them anyway, do you think she went too far? Well, here you go. There was a statement in the synthesis that read like this. Differences in species of sagebrush consumed in the winter may be tied to availability, as well as preferences based on protein and volatile oil levels. Okay, it's sort of saying that sage grouse eats sagebrush. Really? Okay. And then there's some sentences before that more to say that this is why sagebrush is so important out here. We lose it, we lose the bird. She edits it, puts and it's in word, so it's a comment, right, too. I believe that is an overstatement, as they will eat other stuff if it's available. Please provide a cite if you disagree. Now, I can say to you that the professor here could not publish something by arguing that sage grouse eats stuff. Stuff? Could you define stuff? I mean, what? And then she says, find a cite if you disagree. That's like asking the scientists to say, prove that sage grouse don't eat anything but sagebrush. Well, of course they must occasionally eat something else. So it's like asking them to prove the negative. You can't do that. So, you know, essentially, my comment on is, hell yes, she went overboard. Well, essentially, and the end story there is, this gets to Judge Windmill, who's a super federal judge here in Idaho. As a digression, when the head of St. Luke's decides to take on a federal judge in print by saying his decision's wrong, what arrogance. Most people have nothing but respect for Judge Windmill. Pate's up, whatever he is. But how could some guy tell a judge is wrong and say it in print? It's like, whoa, you know, that was on the, whether they were doing some kind of monopoly behavior over there. But anyway, Windmill gets the case and says to push the street and do it again. You've compromised your entire document. There's no way to know that science synthesis has been screwed up so much that what they did, they violated due process. There's a law, none of you probably ever heard of, called the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs how the federal government makes regulations and develops regulatory policy. And essentially the judge used the phrase in that law that says that's an arbitrary, capricious decision. Because I've got evidence here that this document's been so messed up with that you're not even looking at the science. You're just making a purely political decision. Do it again. That's one of the reasons this comes up later. That and the Fish and Wildlife agencies wanted to control what was going on in the science assessment because the funding gets all intermixed between the feds and the state. And one of the ways to avoid, they wanted stuff edited out of Steve and Jack's stuff, as I understand it, that made them uncomfortable. So they said, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to do that book. This thing was peer reviewed 3 times. My preface was peer reviewed 3 times by Reed Noss, among other people, who's a fairly activist conservation biologist. He's good. And then Berkeley published it. Actually, I'm really proud of this because it's actually in the series of studies of avian biology. And I can walk around the park and goes, where's your journal article on avian biology? So they did that to make sure that what was there was the best science possible. And again, it was all peer reviewed 2 or 3 times. Okay. Now that's all a preface to where I'm going here. And so out comes that book. Well, actually before that even, BLM assembles a national technical team to review all the science and to make recommendations back to BLM about state of the science on sage grouse that goes along with this. Some of it's the same stuff and some of it's more of it. It gets complicated. It's how they do this. Well, a certain congressman from Washington named Doc Hastings gets wind of this. And what he does is the BLM had the NTT report peer reviewed. And Jen's probably seen this. I don't know if you guys have seen this, but peer review can be really petty and mean-spirited, okay? Because you got all these academics with big egos. It's also essential, and it can also be very helpful. But I'll tell the story this way. I don't mean to offend anybody and circle around the point here. A good friend of mine wrote a book called Federal Land Western Anger, which is on the sagebrush rebellion of the 70s, okay? And one of the people who reviewed the manuscript was this great professor who's now retired from Berkeley named Sally Fairfax, who was one of the legendary professors of public natural resources in the country. It's a friend of mine. Just this crazy lady. And Sally reviews the book, and Greg's saying something, and she writes, "Horse shit, Greg," in the margin, back to the press. Well, okay, we all know that's Sally, right? And of course, Sally recommends that the book be published. So, but here's what Doc Hastings does. He takes a look at the peer review of the NTT, excerpts out the stuff he wants, and using Sally's example, though this didn't happen in this case. Well, this is bad science because Professor Fairfax said it was horseshit. He tries to discredit the whole report by cherry picking language in the peer review, but it gets worse, okay? In this book is a piece by Oz Garden. Oz Garden is a legendary biology professor who's now emeritus at the U of I. And the House of Representatives gets a hold of this, and Oz's piece is pretty critical to the sort of state of the sage grouse. Where it's at, where the habitat is. It's in there somewhere. And so the House demands all the peer reviews of Oz's piece and the names of the peer reviewers. Now, in some cases, because some of this was federal science, under federal law, it's no problem to provide the peer reviews. In fact, you're required to. If it's federal money involved, in federal science, you have to do this. It's public information. Okay.
Sorry, just so you know, this is the sage grouse population dynamics and probability of persistence. That's his chapter.
Which all science is, right? It's probability assessments. When people say the science is in, what we're really saying is our best probability assessment is this today. This is why science education is so important. Unfortunately undervalued, but I can come back to that. I would salute a great science communicator. Why did we like Carl Sagan? Why did we like Tyson, is it, the guy who did the newest cosmos?
Yeah.
These guys are great communicators. Scientists aren't rewarded for that, though. There's professional jealousy. Sagan made $1 million on his book. Nobody reads your frickin' article, but you're jealous of him who's doing more to communicate the excitement of cosmology, the study of the universe. I mean, scientists can be incredibly petty, narrow-minded, or they can be wonderful, okay? But the point is that was popular science. It wasn't peer-reviewed, but it was based on peer-reviewed stuff. And yet that's not rewarded in our culture, but we all love those people. And we all have sat through those lectures of Professor Big Shot who can't tell his wife anything. He's such a bad communicator, right? I mean, this is the point here. It gets worse. Can Nick write something? Okay, it's fairly important. It's not in there, it's later. This time, the oil and gas industry, and it's in a journal this time. Okay, so it's peer reviewed, submitted to a journal. The oil and gas industry demands to the journal that the names of the peer reviewers and their reviews are made public. Well, that one, I think the journal can go, we are not compelled by any way to release this information. What I'm trying to get with this part of this discussion is, there's an attack on peer review because so much is at stake with sage grouse. And if we're not careful and we discredit peer review, we have nothing left. However flawed peer review can be, it's our only defense against horrible science or such politicized science that we might as well just say, well, who's ever in power is going to win this one, okay? The other side of the equation, though, is scientists have to be very careful. And there's a whole, I work a lot in this area with some colleagues, Bob Lackey at Oregon State's really good at this. It's what I call advocacy science, or Bob's got it's kind of a different name for it, but it's when scientists, well, the simple version is this: they have policy preferences themselves. We all do. But they skew their science to back up where their policy preferences are. So they start with a hypothesis, and I'm simplifying it, that live people grazing is bad under all conditions. So then they do research based on that assumption in their hypothesis, and they find the science that says grazing is bad. Oh, wow. And then they get up there and say, science says grazing is bad. And then you have to delve back into the work to find out that they're either way past where their science said, or they've done pre-selected research to try to get to the conclusion they want to get to begin with. Okay, and this in a really weird way is to say how important science is. But when scientists get in the business of having policy preferences and saying the science demands their preference, they're out of their league. As any of us would be. So I used to make the joke, oh, I have a PhD in political science. Shouldn't my vote count more than yours? I know more than you do. And you'll go, well, baloney. You're going to vote for who you want to vote for based on all your values and everything, just like I am. Okay? Science is no different. Science can inform, but the minute it starts to advocate based on claiming that it's only science that's suggesting this, they jeopardized everything they stood for. Okay? And there's a lot of that goes on. Now, it's fine for a scientist to get up and say, I am passionate about the sage grouse. I do work on it, but I, as a citizen, think it's important to save that species. No problem whatsoever. And here's an example of how interesting this gets. So Steve, a letter came out addressed to Sally Jewell and Tom Millsack, who's the head of the Department of Agriculture. These are from some very prominent sage scientists. I'll read some names. Have you read some of them? William Baker, Wyoming, Jeffrey Beck, Wyoming, Clay Brown, Tucson, Arizona. I think I had his daughter in class a long time ago. Jack Connolly, Lester Flake, not a great name for a scientist. Oz Garden, Robert Gibson, Matthew Holden, Ken Jensen, Kerry Reese, UI, Thomas Rings. And this is a letter about the NTT report in Science, and they're saying, on one hand, they say this NTT is a great report, but then they say, except the part we don't agree with. Well, okay, it's a state-of-the-art science report, and so the part you don't agree with is because you've got other policy preferences, you don't think we're protecting the sage grouse enough. What part don't you agree with? Because up here you say it's such a great report. All right. Okay. And then they go on to say, you know, we need to know more about this and that. And that's fine. But what it ends up looking like to an average person is, so it's doing science here. They're quoting people, but then they're saying this other stuff's good, but except when they don't agree with it. And so what are you exactly saying? Your science is better than their science, or what? All right. they have every right to do this, okay? But it does quite, you might look at it and go, well, they're just scientists that have become advocates for their point of view. Well, it's interesting. I asked Steve, what do you think of this? He goes, I didn't sign that because I don't want to get mixed up in this. I just try to do the best science possible. I'll respond to anybody, but I will not sign a document like that. Okay? And I mean, you can form different conclusions about it, but you do kind of read it like, well, these guys are, stronger about certain protection measures than other scientists and managers are. So it just, if nothing else, can show you how complicated and detailed this gets. Now, you might ask, do I think it's going to get listed? I have no idea. I do worry that these attempts in Congress to put off the listing decision are ill thought out, because right now, this is one of the great versions of the Endangered Species Act. It's brought people together to try to protect the habitat of that bird and its populations. They're compelled out of the fear of a listing and its consequences. You say we got 10 more years, what's going to happen to all that? The rhetoric is, oh, they can work harder now for 10 years. Baloney. You take the threat away from somebody, they'll move on to other stuff. So that's why I argue that's stupid. We're so close, and you see it. I mean, I'm not Pollyanna here, but you see ranchers sitting down in some environs. I got to go on a tour with Sally Jewel down in southern Idaho. With Crapo was there, Rish was there, though Rish was odd. Crapo was there the whole time. The secretary was great. There were ranchers out there, BLM people, Fish and Game people, enviros, the Nature Conservancy, all kind of working on what they're doing to protect habitat. It was the area of China Mountain, and China Mountain was a huge site for wind. And BLM turned down the permit, saying it's too critical, that habitat. And actually, the state director is now actually on detail running a national landscape conservation system for BLM, which is sort of like their crown jewels, way to look at it that way. Tim said, John, I had to make that decision. I thought it was the right one, but it could cost me my career because of the power of the wind people there, but it got sustained. Think about this one for a minute, though. When we like to talk about green energy, look at the conflict it can create. Green policy, Endangered Species Act. Green policy, wind. You put wind in the wrong place, you kill the birds. Everything is complicated, is my point. Wind is great, but not in certain places, or the birds are terrified of the big towers and they fly into them, all right? Wind some places, not others. There's no perfect green policy. I mean, the Endangered Species Act is probably, in a way, as close to a pure good policy there is, but unfortunately it gets used sometimes as a surrogate for other things. Not to protect the sage-grouse, but to shut down ranching. Not to protect the spotted owl, but to end old growth logging. And that can create problems. All right, Mike Simpson was able to pass a rider to a bill, and you had the wolf person last week that more or less declared the studies of the wolf adequate to let states manage it in Montana and Idaho. And that one made sense to me because so many people had worked so hard and it was one group trying to frustrate the process. Sage-grouse is not there yet. I think any attempt to screw with the Endangered Species Act and sage-grouse is a mistake. That's mine, and I've said it publicly. I think we're not there yet. People are working really hard. Let them finish. Okay. I can keep going, but I want to make sure there are questions. You got yours ready yet? Or did I talk way past it and it's
Going back to the fire thing, into everything that you talked about.
Yeah.
And, are you familiar with NICS, National Insect Command System?
Yes.
So that's the major failing where all this takes place in this habitat protection.
That's your assessment, you're saying?
I believe so.
Well, let's hear it. I'm here to learn, like anybody.
How many of y'all know what ICS is? Chris?
It's a marvelous thing that's been used all over the world now to deal with disasters. These guys were sent after 9/11. So as a system, it could be okay. but there obviously can be a criticism of how it's working if you're talking about sagebrush habitat. So proceed.
Oh, yeah, it's good taking it.
That's okay. Everybody's a
Go for
professor.
it.
Go for it.
Is there a?
Oh, we need
Oh,
a
yeah.
Do we have markers up here?
Mr. Melody.
I love
What I
that.
have for
Dry erase marker?
This is what should always happen in a 400 or 500 level class at some point.
Hello, my name's Dan.
I have a PowerPoint. Oh,
So, y'all familiar with the gigantic fire that almost destroyed Yellowstone in the 1980s?
Yes.
Okay, well, right after that fire, they determined that the major cause of the meltdown in that fire was A, fire protection systems in place at that time, and the way responding agencies communicated. So at the end of that fire, FEMA, so we got FEMA, which everybody's heard of, right? They got together with this other agency, NICC, National Incident Command Center. They came up with this idea that they called ICS, which stands for Incident Command System. Now, the idea for this system was to have an organized, unified system that every responding agency in the country, fire, law enforcement, medical, they all operated on the same system. So I being a firefighter in Idaho, I can go to California and it's on the exact same system. So that created this incident command system. It got created, it kind of got pushed to the side with some other systems. Alarm response system was a big one, and law enforcement. Katrina comes along. Everybody knows about Katrina. FEMA totally dropped the ball. Brought everything back to this. So they're like, well, if it was organized and you had one person and all this other good stuff, all that shit, pardon me, with Katrina would not have happened. Aid would have got there faster, but communication was not flowing. So that brought us back to ICS. Now, fast forward to, or maybe it's not fast forward, 1996. Bush instituted a,
that'd still be Clinton.
would it be Clinton? Okay.
06 maybe?
Yeah, 06.
Yeah.
So President Bush initiated a law called the PREA law. Chris knows that one. And the PREA law was built around this system. So that took it into every responding agency in the nation. And our fire system out here that he mentioned, which is like the hub of firefighting in the country, works under this system. So the way this system works is at the very head of the snake, you have the incident commander. Underneath the incident commander, he's got what they call section chiefs. So you have your operations manager, you have a planning manager, you have a logistics manager, and you have a staging manager. Each one of these people has a specific job. Operations manager, they deploy forces. The incident commander calls them up, says, hey, I need this person. This guy finds him and sends him wherever he needs to go. And the way this works is everyone under each one of these columns reports to that person. That person reports to that person. Now there's this other guy, way out here on the side. He is the safety manager. This guy is the only person that can shut him down. So the reason that we as scientists, we as biologists, and this is what I'm getting at, don't have the impact in these sort of systems that we need to have is because in this system, there is no room for an environmental section chief. It does not exist. So when we as biologists go out there and we're like, we need to protect this habitat right here. Incident commander looks at his list and goes, you don't answer me. And he just walks off. Operations not going to listen because you're not on his list. So in order for us to get a foothold here, we really need to get an amendment to this ICS system to include some sort of environmental section chief. Now the safety officer right here, he, in my personal opinion, if I could do this my way, he would be partnered up with the environment. because 2007, Boulder White Cloud Mountains. Giant fire breaks out in Falconberry Complex, destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres of critical wintering ground for bighorn sheep, elk, and a lot of other species in the state. The let it burn policy was enacted, and nobody went in to save this critical habitat because the safety manager said it was unsafe. So there's the National Fire Incident Command Center, something like that monitors all these. And their safety manager, he is an OSHA guy, has absolutely nothing to do with biology. So that is where it fails, and all that domino effects into everything that he mentioned regarding the peer review process and literature and getting all critical. But also tie in.
Good job, Dan.
Yay!
Incident command. Now y'all ready to go fight some fires?
And you put the read guy way down there in the bottom.
Yeah.
The weed guy?
Planning.
Resource advisor. Oh, okay, yeah.
He goes under planning or logistics, depending on
Way down there.
But I mean, the issue is, you know, and where you have incidents, you know, where harm could happen, you have to have that hierarchy, and you have to have one person that can make the final call. And if we go person, property, resources, or person, resources, that safety person is still going to be used.
The lesson here, he's being very specific, and I'm working a little bit, and hopefully there are others in the secretary's order to begin to address this somehow. But sometimes the problem is you got to have people low enough that understand what's going on, and the high-level politicals make it snowed to some extent to understand his point, which is, and the real point here, guys, is all organizations have biases. We're all organized to be a certain way. It may work, they may have incredible bias. Without getting in my soapbox, you know, it's a question. I'm one of the people that is so goddamn sick of STEM all the time. You know why? You know why? It's because that's what the grants are. That's all that's going on. We got to do STEM because if we do that, then we can get the big NSF grants. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what about the humanities? What about critical thinking? And most of the clowns who run this place are all scientists. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said clowns, but the organizational bias here in this university is big science, like it is in every public university. I'm all for it, but it's completely trivialized other parts of the world. And I'll tell you, I can tell you how many times somebody that can't read and write and think critically is really, they need people who can, that can also be good scientists. But that's the organizational bias, that's all. I'd say the same thing if all of a sudden we're just doing humanities. I'd think that's crazy. But where is STEM so damn important in a university relative to everything else? It's because of where the money is. I bring in $1 million grant. That's not bad, right? For a policy guy. I have a lot of people, I'll tell you a dirty secret here. A lot of people have worked, 6 people have worked for me. There's something called overhead. The overhead on my grant is really nice. It's controlled by the federal government, so it's only 17%. But that's on all salary and wages. So essentially, I have to put in my grant what amounts to a kickback to the university of about $80,000, $90,000 at least. What's that to the university? Free money. Well, you know, we paid for your lights and your computer. Now they paid for that anyway, okay? But the point is, this is why we do it. I mean, this is why the university wants us to do it. This isn't what Jen does it. She does because she wants to be a good scientist. She has to have somebody to pay for her science. In some cases, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about why the organizational culture is so big on it. Because that's where these idiots downtown won't give us the money anymore. So where are we going to find the money? We're going to raise your tuition, and we're going to go chase grants. And it's changed everything in higher education. And I don't think necessarily for the good a lot of the time. All right, but that's just like, that's a higher ed example of your point. Organizations are organized for a certain way, but they have biases to them too. I mean, for years, the Park Service and the Forest Service fought like cats and dogs over certain things. You say, well, don't they do the same stuff? Oh no,
They don't. They have their own missions, worldviews. Not that the individual people aren't all great people, but those agencies fought like cats and dogs for generations over land. I think they're much better now. You had a question about that.
Got covered.
Okay.
So
But see, go ahead.
So part of what may be occurring too is this lack of diversity along these hierarchies, right? So you think about both our administration, who's at the top and what type of biases, it's all kind of the same bias, who's at the top of these, right? And so, that's the piece that seems to might make a difference in creating greater language and communication.
And in that case, you're looking at something that's almost a guild. The fire community is almost like a closed guild, and they don't want anybody else in their business. Again, I'm not de-emphasizing their heroic action, but if you're talking about policy change in the name of biological resource protection, if you don't think about what he put up there, you'll fail. At the end of the day, there'll be a big fire, and it'll hose some habitat, and then so why didn't they protect the habitat? You know? And they want to fight fire. And another dirty little secret here in firefighting is overhead. In a bad fire summer, go to the federal land offices and try to find somebody working. Everybody's out fighting the fire. Well, they need them, but they also draw big overhead. So there's an organizational impetus to fight fire and keep fighting fire because it dumps all this money into communities, into people's salaries. And all I'm saying is there's an organizational bias to do that. What do I get rewarded for? Where do I get a call from the provost? Oh, you got your big grant again. I was a professor of the year for the state. You know what I got for that? A pin. Way to go. Professor of the year. But what gets rewarded here are the guys who get the big grants, not the good teachers. You wrote a book? Oh, well, I guess that's good. Oh, you got a grant? I mean, that's the way it is right now. And I'm not critiquing, I certainly wouldn't critique it on behalf of scientists who need grants to do work. But when it distorts things, it can do some interesting.
Well, that's right. I mean, there was our discusn earlier, right? Of outreach and service learning and all those things. They're great, but there's nothing about anything in our structure that we get any credit for that at all.
Well, scientists who are, back to your communication thing, the federal scientists like Steve, obviously you got all kinds of kudos for this, but Steve gives all these talks, all this stuff. They don't get rewarded for that. So where's your journal publication? You just briefed Congress and you changed Senator so-and-so's mind and you gave a talk to the legislature or other people and they really understand the sagebrush. No, we don't care. Where's your journal article? That nobody reads. They'll probably read your stuff more because it's more important, but who reads political science journals? And I get in trouble when I say it around my department, but really, and so I think good science communicators should be rewarded for that as much as publishing in a journal. If they've influenced people and helped them think something through, but you're right, it's not service learning, it's great, but it's not really rewarded.
So how about, I'm gonna ask you one question just so everyone can hear it and then we're gonna take.
Oh yeah, it's up to them, I want to keep that.
How about, how can this new cohort, this new group be better science communicators and have an impact?
Number one, you kind of have to have a passion for it, but it can come slow. I mean, I've talked to thousands of people at once. How do you do it? Aren't you? No, because I've done it for a long time. And I like it. I was a high school teacher, a college coach, all this stuff. If you're really scared of it, but you think it's important, you just have to start doing it. All right? Nobody's going to laugh at you or think you're naked or you're stupid. It's kind of like, there was a musician I used to like who's passed away named John Stewart. He wrote Daydream Believer, among other things, but he did all this great stuff. Anyway, he did this shtick when he was, singing, and he'd go, well, sing along. And then he said, don't be afraid. Everybody thinks everybody's looking at them. They don't care what you do, what you're doing, because they think everybody's looking at them. So just get up and sing or clap your hand. The point is, we think people are
make fun of us, and if they do, it's their problem, not your problem. I mean, so if you're intuiting it's important, you just have to start doing it, whether it be the kids or whatever, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, you gotta practice this, you know. If you're terrified of it, and you really never don't want to do it, you'd just rather be outside, that's fine too. I mean, not everybody's a communicator. Not everybody's a great scientist, you know, but the thing is, I think it goes back probably to your point again, we're organized culturally and biasly that communication isn't as important as journal articles. That's what we say. I don't think that's great, that's accurate. It shouldn't be that way, but I think that's the way it is right now. And we all know you gotta get, at least in our business, you gotta have enough, and I've looked at your Vita and I'm impressed. You've done a lot of stuff, but that's what you gotta do. So another lesson here, and this may be more academics, but it works everything. There's a great book called The Tragedy of Political Science. We sort of said, what the hell's wrong with that discipline? Why isn't it engaging the world rather than assuming everybody's a rational actor and building these complicated models that nobody can understand and read or anything else? But then the guy had great advice. Because I understand, you know, we're organized that way, and I've written my books, and so I'm all for that. He says, do what you need to do to get tenure, then do what you have a passion for. Which doesn't mean go to the bar every day. It means use your passion for politics. Well, yeah, you could, in the sense of use your passion for politics to make the difference you want to make. You know, do what you have to do to get tenure, then do, I mean, so I love doing this stuff and working with the federal government. Yeah, I've got another book coming out, but I'm senior enough now, I kind of ignore, like, oh, who cares? You know, I'm working with the Secretary of the Interior's office. Isn't that neat? You know, not that I think I'm great. You know, it's just an honor to do it. But I kind of decided after 2 books and a lot of articles, why do I have to keep doing the same thing? I mean, I still do them because I like to write, but I'd much rather be in the applied world of public policy, and I'd much rather, I love it when I interact with scientists because I learn from them. And it's much more fun than being in the convention of political scientists. My God. Everybody's got blue blazers on, they look like little penguins, and you know, it's just like, no thanks, people, you know. Of course, scientists are slobs. That's what I like about it. You know, you're out there in the field, you have a t-shirt on. You know, that's the way it should be.
That's so nice. Anyway. All right, well, thank you, and please join us.
And if anybody wants to get a hold of me, I've got a bunch of, I brought some cards, or I'm in Department of Public Policy. You can just look me up. I am glad to talk to people.
Thank you.
It's not just